Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Harold Holzer, the Jonathan Fanton Director of Roosevelt House. Happy holidays in advance to all of you, and so delighted you could join us tonight for a sure sellout, because we're talking about Franklin D. Roosevelt in his house. I want to offer a special welcome to the members of the Roosevelt House Advisory Board who are here. Norton Garfinkel is here, Max Shapiro is here, and the great Bill Vanden Heuvel is here. So welcome. Well, you're all great, but you know Bill is, Ambassador Vanden Heuvel is peerless. Welcome also to Phoebe Roosevelt. We're grateful that you joined us. And welcome, of course, to David Woolner, who is here this evening to talk about his new book, The Last 100 Days, FDR at War and Peace. I'm just looking at his extraordinary cover that you're seeing. What a hopeful and sad cover photograph that is, both hopeful and heartbreaking at the same time. You know, we hear so much about the first 100 days of Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration, and indeed the 100 days preceding his inaugural, because of course this was the center of pre-inaugural activity for FDR, as you've all, I think, heard me say many times. By 1945, indeed beginning in 44, the period that David covers in his book, FDR had, of course, sold Roosevelt House, the house built by his mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, for him and for Eleanor as a wedding present. Roosevelt House, I'm going to begin telling you, as part of my script, was opened as a Hunter College facility in 1943, 75 years ago, with Eleanor Roosevelt cutting the ribbon. And we will be marking that occasion in the fall and celebrating that kind of a diamond jubilee for Roosevelt House. But back to tonight's program. David Woolner, our longtime friend and colleague, is senior fellow and resident historian of the Roosevelt Institute, a group with which we're proud to be associated again this evening. He is also professor of history at Marist College and senior fellow of the Center for Civic Engagement at Bard College. We thank him, and I do want to add greetings and thanks also from Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter College. Thank him for the opportunity his talk gives us, not only to welcome him back to Roosevelt House, but to bring in a new programming partner, the Bard Globalization and International Affairs Program, which mercifully is reported in brief as BGIA, right? That's good. And BGIA, hopefully the first of future partnerships as well, helped us organize tonight's discussion. I want to introduce to you the person who has arranged this partnership and is representing BGIA today. He is Dean of International Studies at Bard, and he is the director of BGIA, James Ketterer. Jim, come up and say hello.
Well, thank you, Harold, and greetings to everyone. And as Harold said, we are so thrilled to begin this partnership, and I'm sure we're going to have many other iterations of events like this, though certainly this will be hard to top, I'm sure. Just a brief word about BGIA. It is a mouthful, the Bard Globalization International Affairs Program. It's a program based here in New York City, even though the Bard campus is upstate, just up the road from Hyde Park. And it brings students here to the city for a semester or a summer to study, to do internships, to revel in all that New York City has to offer. It's kind of our study abroad program in Manhattan. And we're very happy to reach out to other organizations in Manhattan and really, bring life to our presence here. And by working with the Roosevelt House, I think that's a symbol of the way in which Bard wants to be represented here in the city, even though we're considered an upstate entity. Also, this lecture series that we're using as a partnership for tonight is in the name of James Chase. James Chase was a very distinguished author. He was the co-founder of the BGIA program. He was a dear friend and colleague at Bard College, and also was the editor of World Policy Journal and Foreign Affairs. And in his memory, Foreign Affairs also helps to support the James Chase Lecture Series. We have one of these lectures every month on Thursday evenings. And if you go to our website, you can find out more of what we are doing and hope that you come to many more of the events. So with that, I would just like to say thanks again for having us as this partnership, and I turn it back over to you, Harold.
Thank you, Jim. We've just reestablished an acquaintance that we think began in Albany 30 years ago when both of us had more hair and not white beards. But we were reminded of it because even as we speak, our state government is winding down the budget process, and you will all be relieved to know that there will be a state budget tonight, we think, and we can go on with our lives. The other event of today that we must acknowledge, and we asked this question upstairs, and our own Bill Goldstein, our intrepid Bill Goldstein, found the answer. We will admit, David and I didn't know. We didn't ask Bill, he probably would have known. Today's opening day of baseball, right? So we asked ours, and the Mets won and the Yankees are winning, so it's a good day for New York. We asked ourselves, how many first pitches did Franklin D. Roosevelt throw out during his presidency? What more weighty issue is there for us to deal with? And the answer was, if we can believe the web, every year from 1933 until the beginning of World War II, so from 33 to 42, which I think is 10 in a row, he did throw out the first ball in Washington. Pretty amazing statistic. Or am I the only one who cares? Anyway, Jim, thank you again for the partnership. And on to our program. David's book, The Last 100 Days, has already been widely and well reviewed. So we know we will be in good hands this evening. The Washington Post wrote that the book was excellent, remarkably well researched, a valuable contribution to our knowledge of Roosevelt. We are delighted that we are featuring it here tonight. And of course, we invite you to join us after the session for a book signing and a reception upstairs. We're also in good hands because, and so is David Woolner, because we're honored that Richard Aldous, who spoke here so wonderfully in January about his own excellent book about Arthur Schlesinger, the definitive biography of the godfather of Roosevelt studies, Arthur Schlesinger, agreed to return on the other side of the dais, as it were, to interview David Woolner. Our format will be familiar to those of you who have been here before. Professors Woolner and Aldous will speak for about 35 minutes. We will have time for audience Q&A, which Professor Aldous will moderate, and then we'll celebrate and buy books. So please welcome Richard Aldous in conversation with the author of the evening, David Woolner.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Harold. I have to say, even as the introductions were being made there, I was just thinking about the wonderful, well, maybe it isn't serendipity, it's a genuine coming together of Bard, which is literally just down the road from Hyde Park and the Roosevelt's house there, and then speaking in this wonderful venue, Roosevelt's house in Manhattan. It seems quite genuinely to be a partnership made in heaven. I think I'm going to reveal myself very early on. This is a spoiler alert for everyone in the audience. This really is an absolutely magnificent book. It's beautifully written. The way that it reevaluates FDR, the subtlety of this book, the way that it navigates the various historiographical debates. It is a most wonderful book. I'm really looking forward to discussing it with David. But first of all, I really do just want to say congratulations on producing such a wonderful piece of scholarship. I guess that the place that I'd like to begin is something which is established very early on in the book. It's right there throughout the entirety of the book, and that is the sense of Roosevelt literally being a man who's very ill. That is apparent. He's a heavy smoker. He's had the years of office, the disability. So my first question to you is, why does he even run in 1944? Why do we even have these last 100 days?
Well, it's a very good way to begin and a good question. And before I start, let me just quickly extend my thanks to Roosevelt House and to Jennifer Robb and Harold Holzer and Bill Goldstein for helping organize this, and of course to James Ketterer and BGIA. I'm delighted that we've seen this partnership, and it's great to see so many old friends, Ellen Chesner from the Roosevelt Institute and Bill Van Den Heuvel, Phoebe, and Roosevelt and Sally Menard and Norton. So it's great to be here for me too. It's kind of like a homecoming in some respects. Bill and I remember the very early days of this project when things were quite different upstairs, tiles falling off the wall and so forth. So it's great to see what this institution has become. It's just absolutely fantastic. And of course, under Harold's great leadership. I have to do this because I dedicated the book to my father. Bill knows that I'm very dedicated to my father, and I've done this at every talk that I've given about this book, so I'm going to do it again. And my father was a great joke teller. And he lived to be 102 years old, and he died really literally the hour I was writing the last paragraph of this book, and he knew I was going to dedicate it to him. I had to dedicate it to him posthumously. But it's a joke about two fathers who meet in a park during the late 30s, early 40s, I would say. And one father's a brand new father. He's pushing a baby stroller, and he's got his baby son, and he's very, very proud. And he meets his friend, and his friend says, "Oh, can I see the baby? This is wonderful. Congratulations! It's this newborn son." And the father's so proud, and he's beaming, and he says to his friend about his son, "Who knows? Someday he may grow up to be president." And his friend says, "And what's wrong with Roosevelt?" It's the only Roosevelt joke I ever heard my father say. Well, it's a very good question. Part of me thinks that he should not have run in 1944. I mean, he clearly was a man in a very dire state of health. He had developed congestive heart failure at this point. He was more and more finding himself more and more exhausted. And there was a certain ambivalence in the summer of 1944. I don't think he was joking when he said, "All that is within me cries out to go back to my home on the Hudson River." I think he was very sincere about that. He wrote to other friends that, he really wouldn't be bitter if Dewey won. He wouldn't weep bitter tears, he said, because he really wanted to go back to private life. He used to call himself Exhibit A. And I'm tired of being Exhibit A, being the president and wanting to do that. On the other hand, this is Franklin Roosevelt, and part of him loved being president of the United States. And of course, he wanted to see the war through to its conclusion, and he wanted to see the establishment of the United Nations. So I think, to a certain extent, he was torn. And initially, he didn't really campaign. He just kind of thought, well, my record stands for itself. But Dewey was so kind of, there were some sort of surreptitious attacks on his health and other things, calling his administration tired old men. It really got under Roosevelt's skin. Dewey himself never actually directly mentioned his health issue, but there were lots of reports in the papers. A vote for Roosevelt is a vote for Truman, for example. There were headlines like that. It wasn't a huge issue, but it was out there, and I think it really got to Roosevelt. So he plunged into this campaign with tremendous vigor and made this spectacular tour through the boroughs of New York in a driving rain in an open car, just to show everybody that he still had it, and he was going to take this election, and he did. And he called it the most bitter campaign of his entire career.
You have a great quote from Wallace at the inauguration where he describes Roosevelt as being a gallant figure but also pitiable.
Yeah.
And in a way that's a theme that you play with throughout the entire book, this sense of his courage, also his vision, but also this awareness of his declining powers, including the fact that, very often he just has to go off and rest, and that physically he's clearly struggling.
Yeah, it's there's some very, if I not to blow my own horn here, but there are some kind of moving moments in the book. One in particular, the weekend he spends with Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King. One of the things about Roosevelt that's interesting is that there were very few people with whom he could relax. Harry Hopkins was one who had the gift of knowing when he wanted to talk about affairs of state, but also knew when to shut it off and just let the president relax. Daisy Suckley was another, Lucy Rutherford. So there were just a handful of people with whom he could sort of let his hair down, so to speak. And of course, as you all know, he had this famous cocktail hour at 5 o'clock every day, which he called the children's hour, and which he forbid, and this is very telling, he forbid the discussion of policy. So, I think part of the reason I wrote the book is because when you start to realize that here's a man tasked with the responsibility of being president of the United States and running a global war in this kind of physical state, the determination that he had to finish the job, so to speak, is really quite extraordinary and very admirable. So I think that is part also what I tried to portray in the book, and as we know, he was regarded widely as a casualty of the Second World War, and I think that was a fair judgment.
Yeah, I have to say one of my favorite stories in the book is when Stalin he's very concerned because he realizes that Roosevelt doesn't have the lemons so he can make his martinis at Yalta, and personally make sure that the president does. But we'll come back to Stalin. So remind us what Roosevelt has on his plate, because we tend to think by this stage, well, the Second World War, the end of that's inevitable. Obviously, they're going to win, but we forget. This is in the middle of the Ardennes offensive,
right?
So on. So what does Roosevelt face in these last 100 days?
Right. Again, I tried to portray that in that opening prologue, which is called "The Last Christmas." Again, there's a kind of irony here because it's only the second time in this 12 years in office that he went back to Hyde Park to celebrate Christmas. And one would assume that this is a moment where he's going to be able to rest and to recoup and regain his energy. But of course, and there is this tranquil scene. As a Minnesotan and a Canadian, winter to me is a moment of great beauty and tranquility and peace. And you can imagine Springwood. I have a great slide. I won't bother to show it. A Springwood in the winter, and the peacefulness of that Hudson River Valley in December of 1944. But of course, on the other side of the Atlantic, there's this massive counteroffensive that the Germans have launched. The United States is in a terrible manpower shortage. We tend to forget just how close a thing it was. General Marshall, in providing a memo to Roosevelt about the 1945 State of the Union address, said, "We are about to enter the most critical period of the war." So this idea that the war is essentially done. We were not even in Germany yet. And so, and I think adding to all of this is a couple of other things that I try to bring out in the opening. One is that, there was a lot of expectation in the summer of 1944 when the Allies finally broke out and swept across northern France. Maybe the war will be over by Christmas, and of course now it is Christmas, the war is not over. But the other thing was the growing awareness in the press, among the public and among members of Congress, that there were serious divisions among the Allies and a real fear of what was called unilateralism, that the British were determined to establish a conservative regime in Greece, willing to put down a communist insurgency is the wrong word, but the communists had become in the ascendancy in the political environment in Greece in 44, end of 44, after the Nazis had left. And of course, Stalin is threatening and then does establish a provisional government in eastern Poland called the Lublin government. So you had this situation at the end of 44 where there's serious divisions among the Allies. And let's not forget also that there were serious issues over the United Nations. So there's no reason to expect that everything is fine. On top of all of this, there's this very curious episode, and I'm kind of proud of this because this is, I don't think, ever really been seriously reported. Suddenly, in the middle of December 45, it's discovered that the Atlantic Charter was never signed. And there is this sort of 48-hour period where people are saying, well, what does this mean? Does this mean that it doesn't have any weight? It's really just a press release. And the Chicago Tribune is a headline, American people fooled by Roosevelt over the charter. And so when we think about the end of the war, we always think about the Soviet Union and the Cold War. But for the American public at the end of 1944, beginning of 45, it's Britain and the Soviet Union. Are we fighting this war for British imperialism? Are we fighting this war to support Soviet domination of Poland, and so forth and so on? So there were serious, serious issues. And a number of congressmen came to see the president and said, we've got to do something about this. It's quite serious.
So a lot of these issues that you've discussed they try to untangle them, or they're jostling for position at Yalta, which is clearly the most famous event of these last 100 days. I mean, before we move on to the substance, again, one of the things that is wonderful about this book is the way in which David there's a constant interplay between the personal and the political, including the astonishing fact that this man, the president, who you've already established is in physically very frail condition, travels 13,000 miles to go to Crimea for this conference. There's a boat trip, a plane trip, a car trip. I mean, how does he even physically cope with this, and what kind of impact does that have?
Yeah, that's also very interesting, and I regard the book as something of a travelogue. It really is, and I insisted with my editor that there had to be maps, because he's going all over the world, and I finally won that fight, and actually a friend of mine drew the maps, which was wonderful. One of the consistent aspects of Roosevelt's career is that there were these periods where he would, ever since at the onset of polio, when he was 39, he would get away and go down to Warm Springs and recoup his health. And there was this sense that he would, he had this sort of miraculous ability to what they call bounce back, regain his strength. So when it came to Yalta, there were serious conversations. Would this help him, or would this tire him? Because at Tehran, excuse me, it was Tehran. It was widely regarded that the Tehran conference, which comes at the end of 43, that he never really recovered from that, and that's when they discover he has cardiac disease, and that's when the doctors order him to work 4 hours a day, which of course is absolutely ludicrous. He's not going to follow that regime. So there's a kind of interesting speculation among those closest to him, like Grace Tully. Maybe this is just what he needs. And Roosevelt himself kind of speculates about it. So he decides to go ahead and make the trip. And, I spend a good deal of time looking at that, because it's an extraordinary story. The effort that's involved in moving the President of the United States in the midst of a still active war halfway around the world is just extraordinary. I mean, for example, just quickly, the Quincy, they had to install 2 elevators. You couldn't have the president without an elevator.
Although when he gets to Yalta, he's
there's no
marooned
elevator
on the ground floor.
That's
because
right.
there's
That's
no...
right. So there's this constant, recognition. I tried to point out in the book time and time again that, this is really something. The escort destroyers, the 3 escort destroyers, or one of the things that I think of often, is the narrow 9-mile gap between North Africa and Gibraltar. And so if you can imagine a major warship, my father comes from Prince Edward Island in Canada, and it's the same distance. And if you get any elevation, 9 miles is nothing. You can see easily across 9 miles of water. And so if you can imagine this ship with 6 escort destroyers, another cruiser, 2 Catalina black flying boats flying overhead, dragging sonar wires into the water, 5 escort fighters, and a blimp, just to get this man, and through this treacherous water, and he sleeps. And Anna Roosevelt is so thrilled. She wants to see this. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. But, the captain is really nervous. There had been submarine sightings, and, it is possible that something could happen. So it's a very dramatic part of the story, and they station rescue boats all the way through the air route and so forth and so on. So, and people did die, actually. From the Foreign Office, one of the ships could not find Malta in the night, and it crashed into the sea, and 12 out of 19 people were killed, including Anthony Eden's personal secretary.
So there's a courage even
Or personal bodyguard.
to him going.
Yeah,
So let's talk about what happens when he's there. The criticism of Roosevelt is always that he's miscalculated, because Stalin by this stage has already achieved most of his territorial ambitions. Very soon he's going to be in Berlin. You wrestle with that question sometimes on an hour-by-hour basis, kind of at the conference. What's your answer to that criticism?
Yeah, wrestle is a good word. I used to say to my wife when I was working on Yalta, Yalta's going to kill me. Look, I try to make the point in the book that a couple of things. One is that when the United States entered the war, it's rather extraordinary. We don't have time to get into this kind of detail, really, but Joseph Stalin was very consistent. From the moment that the British and the Americans decided they were going to try to help him fend off the German onslaught, even in the very early conversations about what kind of supplies they can give and trying to have a supply mission. So we're talking September 41. You know, I call it his shopping list. He hands over his shopping list immediately, as Eurus will tell you. Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic states, Eastern Poland. You know, he's very consistent, and he wants to talk, even though they can't talk above ground. They can only meet with Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, in the subway system because it's too dangerous in Moscow to be above ground because the Germans are 15 miles away and they're bombing the city. And he even, so he has the audacity to say, let's talk about the end of the war, So there's a real consistency there. And I try to make the point that for Roosevelt getting into the war, this is right when Pearl Harbor happens, and all of a sudden the British are asking Roosevelt, what do you think about all these demands? And the British are very anxious to give Stalin the help he needs and to sign some kind of agreement. Roosevelt adopts what he calls the policy of procrastination. His understanding, of course, is that he's in a weak position now. He will be in a stronger position later. So better to talk about these issues at the end of the war when the United States, which has still got to put together its army and so forth, will be in a stronger position. So, what I try to show in the book is that, of course, there's a kind of irony or there's a kind of flaw in that argument, because the opposite is also true, that the Russians are going to become much stronger and the Russians are going to be able to advance. And so they kind of actually meet at Yalta. It's a kind of moment of realization where, that whole critical issue of just how much control the Soviet Union is going to have over Eastern Europe is going to be wrestled with in a very serious way. So, but I don't think he had any illusions. There are many conversations in the book where, he tells his new ambassador to Poland, the Polish government in exile, Arthur Bliss-Lane, or he tells the Polish government prime minister, the leader in exile, we're not going to fight the Russians. You're going to have to get along with the Soviet Union, and neither the British. There's just no way. And one of the things I explore quite extensively in the book is the agreement that the Czech leader, Beneš, negotiated with Stalin. And Roosevelt refers to this on a number of occasions. Why can't the Poles be like the Czechs? The Czechs negotiated an agreement which guaranteed a certain degree of sovereignty. So it's a real challenge. But I think the notion that he was naive about this is not true. I think the notion that he was not in control of his faculties is not true. The reality is that Soviet power is there. It has to be reckoned with. And what he tried to do, and Churchill tried to do, is ameliorate the situation as best they could.
I guess as you say, one argument that historians have made is that he's very naive. And that he's duped. The other argument that historians have made, which again you discuss in the book, is that actually he's very cynical, and that effectively he's happy to throw the provisional government in Poland under the bus because he wants a deal on the United Nations.
Yeah, I do make this point in the book, and I think it's important to recognize that for Roosevelt, the larger picture, the bigger picture is by far more important. And And there's no question, and I think Churchill is in this as well, although for Churchill, because Britain went to war over Poland, Poland is a much more difficult question for Churchill politically, and we should remember that part of why Churchill is upset about Poland is because he may be facing an election, and he doesn't want to have this Polish situation confronting him. And don't forget, Churchill goes back to Parliament and says, I know of no government in the world that keeps its word more than the Soviet government. And he tells a friend privately, I think Neville Chamberlain was wrong about Hitler, but I don't think I'm wrong about Stalin. So, you can't just focus on FDR in this question. Churchill also, they thought that Stalin was a man they could do business with. That doesn't mean that they didn't recognize that he was a brutal dictator. That doesn't mean they didn't. But, there is no chance of continued peace and cooperation or the establishment of the United Nations if the Soviet Union is not involved. And I think what's really important is to remember that Roosevelt saw Yalta and the Yalta Agreement as a first step, as he says in his Yalta speech. This is the beginning of something new. We can get into the details in question, or you can ask me more questions. But the basic parameters were there long before Yalta long before they got to Yalta.
As you say, I'm sure that we'll return to Yalta in the Q&A. But Yalta is the most famous thing in this book, the most famous thing that Roosevelt is doing. One of the real surprises in the book, something that doesn't really get covered as much, is the diplomacy which he does on the way back from Yalta, and in particular, this fascinating story which you tell about his intervention in Middle Eastern politics, particularly on the Palestine question, and specifically the meeting with the Saudi king. Tell us about that.
This is something I decided that I really wanted to look at very carefully. It's an extraordinary story, in part because Roosevelt was absolutely determined that, he had great faith in his own powers of persuasion. He really thought that he had an extraordinary gift to try to convince people to do his bidding. He makes a determination that on the way back from Yalta, he's going to stop at the Great Bitter Lake, which is part of the Suez Canal complex, and the USS Quincy is waiting there for him. He flies down, and he sends a destroyer down to Jeddah to meet the Saudi king, who's never left his kingdom, never flown in an airplane, to take him back up to meet the President of the United States. Keep in mind that, he's determined to do this. I mean, to the extent where both Churchill and Stalin ask him to stay longer at Yalta. And no, I've got 3 kings I'm going to visit in the Middle East. He saw the king of Egypt. That was kind of a necessity because he's in Egyptian territory. He met with Haile Selassie, which is also very interesting, very dignified sort of meeting. And then, of course, he met with Ibn Saud. The story of Ibn Saud is fascinating for a number of reasons. First of all of his advisors and all of the major government departments told him not to do it. The War Department didn't want him to do it because the preparation for this, was in the fall of 1944. As I said, he starts talking about this idea, particularly after the election. There's a manpower shortage. And any unrest in the Middle East that could have an impact on troop dispositions for the British and the Americans in the European theater would just be absolutely a disaster. So they're against it. The State Department, of course, is very concerned about this budding new relationship with the Arab world. And the Americans had just acquired a huge swath of oil rights in eastern Saudi Arabia. And there's a line in the book where Roosevelt draws a map. He's meeting with the British Foreign Secretary and draws a little map of Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. It says, Iraq oil is yours, we share Kuwait, Saudi Arabia is ours. So it's a very serious matter. The United States was now using more oil than it was producing. And so the State Department was dead against it. And then he would ask people, his advisors, and they all said the same thing, you won't make any headway with this man. And he sent an envoy, Colonel Hoskins, earlier, a year or so earlier, to meet with the king, who spoke Arabic. And absolutely, he got nowhere. And so everyone said it's impossible. There's a wonderful line in the book from Herbert Feist, who was an economic advisor at the time, who said, he met with Roosevelt in the White House with mother, and he started talking about this trip to the Saudi Arabian, to meet the Saudi Arabian king. And Feist said, I've heard of men who thought they could be king of the Jews. I've heard of men who thought they could be king of the Arabs, but I've never met a man who thought they could be king of both the Arabs and the Jews. And he was talking about Roosevelt. And it's a wonderful story too because of the way that it takes place. The king's prime minister comes on board this destroyer, and he's taken down to the stateroom where, with its nice bed and its bathroom, private bath, and so. He says, "The king can't sleep here. This is ridiculous. This is not at all appropriate." So they actually cover the deck with carpets and build a Bedouin tent on the deck. And not only that, the king has to eat fresh lamb every day. And the king, by the way, wanted to feed the entire crew because he thought he would have to be hospitable. So when they showed up as they're loading this destroyer with actually 100 sheep, and the captain said, he had to make all these stories about how you couldn't. So they compromised at 8. And there is a photo, well, that's not in the book, it's on my slide presentation. You can see they put up a scaffold in the back of the ship and they're slaughtering the sheep, and the sailors are having a great time with this. So it's a wonderful story. But unfortunately, and Roosevelt says, after they have the niceties, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but he said, the Jews have suffered eviction, persecution, mass murder, and he says, "I feel partially responsible. Is there anything you can do to help me with this problem?" And 3 times he goes back to this effort to try to convince him to allow for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And his argument is it's a huge area, there's plenty of room, and he also was a great admirer of the Jews who were living in Palestine. He was a great fan of that book, Palestine, Land of Promise, by Walter Clay Loudermilk, and he thought that he even made the argument that this could help the Arab population. But of course, the king wouldn't have anything to do with this, and actually finally gets a little irritated. And Roosevelt called it the great failure of his career. And he said that to 3 or 4 separate people on 3 or 4 separate conversations.
And actually, in this sense of beginnings that you talk about, this sense of going forward, that's something that becomes very clear when he goes back. You describe very movingly this scene where he goes to report to Congress, and for the first time, he's wheeled down the aisle in his wheelchair, and then sits to deliver his address to Congress.
Yes.
And that's a kind of very emotional moment for kind of everybody, and you describe it in a very moving way. But then one of the incredible things about these last few weeks of Roosevelt's life is how you describe the things that he's thinking about doing, including 2 incredible things. One is that he thinks about giving up the presidency, maybe to become the Secretary General of the United Nations, which you don't overplay. I mean, you kind of mention it, but you don't overplay it. But also this idea that maybe he would give up the presidency and he would go as a kind of an envoy to the Middle East, perhaps with Eleanor, to kind of try and focus on this kind of issue. Yeah. So I've got 2 questions about that. One, maybe tell us a little bit more about that. And then 2, that seems to me to suggest that one of the things that we often think about Roosevelt is actually wrong. And that is that he didn't have confidence in Truman. If he's thinking about the idea that perhaps he will go to the United Nations, that seems to suggest to me that actually he does have confidence in the man who's his vice president.
That's a very good, a very interesting question. People often ask me when I'm talking about the book, why didn't he spend more time with Truman? Why didn't he? Well, the simple answer is Roosevelt wasn't there. He's gone. I mean, the last 100 days, he's almost 5 weeks at Yalta. He's constantly trying to get relief. It's almost as if he doesn't want to be in the White House. He's going back to Hyde Park. He goes to Yalta, and of course, then he goes back to Hyde Park again. Then he goes down to Warm Springs. I make this point that in the book that the longest period he spends in the White House is in sort of mid-March, 16 days in a row. That's the longest period he was in the White House. But to get back to your question about Truman, so I think it's a very, very, very good question. I'm not surprised you asked me because you're a sharp fellow.
And I like Truman.
Yes, I know. I think Roosevelt had confidence not only in Truman but in the government itself. I mean, by this point, even though a number of people are dying, even though other people are retiring, there was a kind of machinery in place through General Marshall and the military command that's really functioning almost like a machine, and which was a good thing considering his health. Many of the telegrams that were drafted in the last 100 days to Churchill or to Stalin were drafted by Admiral Leahy or by General Marshall. Roosevelt looked at every one. He made edits to every one. And by the way, that wasn't unusual. Churchill would be the same. Stalin also the same. Molotov sometimes would draft the telegraphs. These are busy people. So I think you may be right that he maybe had more confidence in Truman than we realize. Of course, Roosevelt doesn't write things down, and he doesn't always say what he's thinking, so we don't know.
So we're kind of beginning to draw to the end of this part of the evening. When you look at the 100 days in their entirety, and you think about this in the context of Roosevelt's entire career, do you think that they enhance his legacy, or do they diminish his legacy?
Well, I think they enhance his legacy, and I hope I tried to convey that in the book. I mean, again, going back to the question of whether or not he should have run, the strict answer maybe is no. I mean, he clearly was sort of playing Russian roulette with his health and so forth. He's clearly a man who's got real serious physical challenges. But on the other hand, he is the one who held that alliance together. He's the one that really was the sort of inspiration for the post-war creation of the United Nations and the international system that we embrace, which also includes the economic provisions of Bretton Woods and so forth. So he's really kind of the glue that held all this together. And so the other side of me is of course, greatly relieved and thankful that he did run. He gave his life for all of us, for this vision, and I think we owe him a great deal of debt.
And was there some kind of basic politics in there? Because, of course, one of the things about him running is it means that Wallace doesn't become president. And it's clear by that stage that he believes that would be, if not a disaster, then certainly unfortunate.
Yeah, his abandonment of Wallace is not something that he personally did. I mean, that is orchestrated by his aides and the political party bosses in the summer of 1944. Wallace was never popular with the old guard of the Democratic Party. He was considered too left-wing. He also, was a Republican originally and then switched over to the Democratic Party. He was very popular with the rank and file among the Democrats, particularly the more progressive wing of the party. But there's something that I would say about this, and I also think this is not well known. I think Roosevelt was already thinking about the United Nations. He clearly was. And the last thing he wants is a fight with the Senate. And you can really see the decision not to fight keeping Wallace on. What he says is he endorses Wallace, sort of perfunctorily. But they've clearly orchestrated other choices, and they present these choices to him, and he says, well, whatever Truman would be fine. Although he never publicly says that. But, it's a very interesting fact that Roosevelt picked most of the undersecretaries of the state when Stettinius came in the fall of 1944. Cordell Hull is going to retire. Stettinius comes in to take over the Secretary of State. And most of the assistant secretaries are very conservative. And Eleanor wrote him a letter. Harold, this got edited out of the book, saying, what is this? She said, you might as well have elected Dewey with these guys. She was very critical of these appointments. But I'm convinced that he was concerned about the United Nations, and he didn't want to be branded as a left-wing, he didn't want that to jeopardize the support he needed in the Senate to ratify the charter. And so that's the reason. Of course, again, he's not going to say this stuff publicly, but I think living around him for enough years now, that probably was part of his motivation. And he says, by the way, in his December 19th, 1944 press conference, he makes this comment, well, I'm really just a little left of center. It's very consistent with that idea that he didn't want to risk a problem in the Senate with the UN Charter.
Well, we're going to turn to questions now. So if you'd like to just raise your hand, catch my eye. I was at an event recently where the chair said, in introducing the questions, if you could make your first sentence a question and your second sentence non-existent. Yes, lady here. Yes, there's a microphone coming down.
So much for such a wonderful presentation. You mentioned Eleanor only once, so tell us, the question is, where was Eleanor in these years, in these 100 days?
That's a very, thank you for asking that, Ellen. Eleanor is a part of the story. Of course, they're separated much of the time because Franklin is in Yalta. And one of the kind of sad parts of the book is that Eleanor actually asked Franklin if she could go to Yalta, and he said no. It's kind of, again, this is only a couple of weeks after he had a private conversation with his son Elliot at Christmas time, saying that he kind of longed for the old days when he and Eleanor were closer. He's hoping that they're going to get closer together again, that sort of thing. And yet, when she asked to go to Yalta, he says no. He says people would fuss too much over you and so forth. And he suggests rather that Anna go. And so Anna goes. And she's a very important part of this book, actually. She plays a very critical role these last 100 days. And the excuse, of course, is that Sarah Churchill is going to be there. So, and Anna, by the way, was very anxious to go because she said, my brothers have all gone to these summits. Why can't I go to one of these? And so she was quite determined. And then Eleanor is kind of there in the background in the sense that, for example, when he goes to Warm Springs, she's quite happy that Daisy Suckley and also Polly Delano are going to go with him because she actually says to Franklin, they'll be able to provide you company that I can't really provide you, companionship that I'm not really able to provide you. And there's these extraordinary letters between the two of them and phone conversations that are really quite touching. And the other thing that's interesting is that Churchill had invited Roosevelt to England, and he was very excited about going over with Eleanor. And there's this conversation he has with Francis Perkins about buying new clothes for Eleanor, and really he's very excited about this future trip. So there's a kind of tenderness between the two of them in these last days. And when he dies, really Daisy Suckley, who really I think knew Franklin Roosevelt better than anybody, she says it's a great tragedy of their life that they just couldn't spend that time together. That they both loved each other, but somehow, she wasn't able to provide that kind of companionship that he wanted. And she's very much a political advisor to him. She's a serious political advisor. And so, he wants Anna there at Yalta so he can just relax. He doesn't want to talk about issues.
Yes. Yeah, microphone's now coming. Thank you.
Okay, well, you introduced this topic, the whole question about Truman. Everybody, or most people, thought they were picking the next president when they picked the vice president. And you said, well, FDR said Truman, they said Truman, and that's okay. Can you give us a little bit more detail on that? Because all the history I've written, there are a million different stories about how Truman emerged, and Roosevelt, sort of was very passive and said, okay.
That's true. He's somewhat passive. I mean, part of what I've gotten to know the Wallace grandchildren, and happily they gave me access to the unpublished version of Wallace's diary, so I looked at quite a bit at that episode. And it's extraordinary, the lack of bitterness on the part of Henry Wallace is really quite admirable, that he continues to serve both Roosevelt and Truman after this event. No, I think, first of all, by July of 1944, he is exhausted. He doesn't want a major political fight. He doesn't want to jeopardize in any way what he sees as a necessary re-election because he wants to see the end of the war through. And so, from that perspective, he's not willing to risk political capital to fight for Henry Wallace. Franklin Roosevelt is a politician, and from his political calculation, this was a political fight he didn't want to fight at that time. I also think it's very interesting, and Richard, you may be interested in this. The really critical election, and I do make this point in the book, is not 1944. The really critical election is 1940. This is when it's unprecedented. He's going to run for a third term. And the reason he's going to run for a third term is because of the war. And he says to the public, old Dr. New Deal is going to now become Dr. Win the War. And that's the summer that he picks Henry Wallace. And that's a decision that Roosevelt makes, right? And it's also the summer, and I do make this point in the book, that he says to James Farley, a man in my condition could drop dead at any moment. And he's talking about picking a vice president and how important it is. And at that point in Roosevelt's career, I'm convinced he was concerned about the future of the New Deal, that he was going to be preoccupied with the war. If he dropped dead, who's going to carry the New Deal forward? And so he picked Wallace. So I think that tells you a lot about the respect that he had, genuine respect he had for Henry Wallace. But in 44, it's a different situation. He's more focused on foreign policy, the United Nations, getting those things through. And Wallace is a potential liability there. And so that's why he acquiesces in the decision to appoint Truman, who's just not controversial.
I know we have a lot of students here from CUNY and from BGIA. Any students who want to ask a question? I have to say, in my experience, that's very unusual. Yes, at the end, if you could just wait for the microphone. Thanks.
Did you have a clear explanation about why he didn't tell Truman about the atomic bomb?
Well, good question. The State Department wasn't brought into the atomic bomb. Lots of people were not brought into the atomic bomb project. And actually, it's December 30th, 1944, when Henry Stimson comes to the White House and really urgently wants to talk to Roosevelt about the atomic bomb and brings Leslie Groves with him. It's about security issues. It's a long story, about the possibility that some French scientists might go back to France and spill the beans about the bomb. And it's interesting because at that point, Roosevelt's already, again, he's always thinking ahead, and he realizes now we're going to have to think about the political dimension of the bomb. And he says, we should bring in Secretary Stettinius. So all of a sudden, you've extended the knowledge of the Manhattan Project for the first time to the State Department. And the State Department actually appoints James Dunn to be the liaison on the atomic bomb. So it's an evolving, that's a kind of an evolving moment, right? I think if Truman and Roosevelt had been spending time together in a meaningful way during this period, probably he would have extended that knowledge. But when you read the book, this is a very busy person, and he's really obsessed with fixing these problems. These are serious problems between Greece, Poland, the whole, getting the war with Germany over with, the Ardennes crisis. He doesn't really have time to spend with Truman, and I think had there been that opportunity, my guess is that he would have brought him in.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Sure.
Would he have used the bomb?
That's a good question. There is a conversation in the book. This is also in the book because I do go back and forth. He had a conversation in September 1944 with Winston Churchill. There was a political movement, quite a strong movement among some senior scientists and policy people to share the atomic secret. That's a growing kind of, there's almost kind of momentum in 44 and 45. So that's a question that's out there. And Winston Churchill was absolutely dead against this idea. And so he forces a second agreement, which is called the Hyde Park Agreement, called after the Second Quebec Conference. And the opening sentence is something like, the notion of sharing the atomic bomb secret is not accepted. It's just a very categorical statement. But they have this conversation, and in the conversation, Roosevelt talks about a demonstration of the bomb, potentially in Japan or perhaps in the United States, instead of using it. But then he says, but we don't even know if it's going to work. And, it's kind of like, it's like a lot of those things. He'll decide that later. So one of the more interesting stories in the book, of course, that I'm quite proud of, is we all know about the first Einstein letter that comes to Roosevelt in the fall of 1939, which instigates the Manhattan Project. And in that letter that comes in 1939, there is a memo from Leo Szilard, who's the physicist who's really responsible for discovering nuclear fission, and he's the one that's putting the scientific weight behind this idea you could build a bomb. And so in the spring of 1945, Leo Szilard, who's not part of the atomic bomb project, not part of the Manhattan Project, is working in the University of Chicago, and he can't sleep at night. He's suddenly realizing that this is going to completely change the nature of warfare. And he's desperate to try to talk to Roosevelt about the implications of using the atomic bomb. But of course, all the secrecy surrounding this makes it very difficult. So he decides that he would go back to Einstein. And there's actually a second Einstein letter that most people don't realize. It comes in March of 1945, during the last 100 days. And Szilard cannot tell Einstein, because Einstein wasn't part of the Manhattan Project. He can't be specific about why he wants to see the president. But he says, can you please get me an appointment with the president? And of course, the way to do this is to contact Eleanor. So the letter is drafted, sent to Eleanor Roosevelt. She gives it to the president. And Szilard is actually sitting at his desk reading the response from Eleanor that he will have his appointment with the president, where he was going to bring up the moral question, should you use the bomb? And Szillard's very excited. He gets up and kind of goes out to talk to a friend and tell him the news, because he's just received this letter from Eleanor about the appointment, which would be in early May. And the day is April 12th, 1945. So he never got his chance.
So I'd see that we have about 30 seconds. One last question, which actually is from a Bard student, Emily.
Hi, I've had Richard's classes twice. I have a question. So this is a big question, so you can go a lot of different ways with this. To either of you. I'm going to ask a question now. So if FDR could see how our international order has changed, what would he say? And that could be how the role of the president has changed, or that conflict between Israel and Palestinians is still going on 70 years later.
Well, just quickly, I make the point in the book, I think it's important to recognize that when Roosevelt goes to the Great Bitter Lake, it's the first example of the United States president trying to negotiate an understanding between the Arabs and the Jews, which is something that's going to go on for every president since. So, and it also is an indication that the United States is now considering itself a global power, that any area of the world, this was traditionally a British part of the world, British sphere of influence, that we are now going to be engaged in these different parts of the world. In terms of the larger question of how he would see the international situation today, well, maybe I should do a little quick demonstration that we could end with. I brought my slides. Richard will forgive me if I think I'm told that this works if I give it a second. Let's just think, what Roosevelt would do is he would say, take out your maps. And what he did was, this is February of 1944. Of course, he is famous for his fireside chats. And what he said to the American people was, you can't think of the United States anymore as a lone continent protected by the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. He said, this is a new kind of war. It is a war on every continent, every sea lane, and most importantly, every air lane in the world. And he said, a far better way to look at the world is through a polar projection map. And if you look at it from a polar projection, you can see that the United States is actually very close to the Eurasian continent, and we're not actually that far away from these troubles. And then when you add in air power, you realize, my gosh, we are quite threatened. And so from his perspective, that because World War II was essentially caused by economic crisis, that Nazism and anti-democratic forces came out of this global economic crisis, freedom from want becomes a key element in U.S. foreign policy, that we have to worry about our neighbors, right? Because if you have poverty and destitution in other parts of the world, it might end up in fascism. So people's well-being is actually tied to U.S. security. And so he continued to publish these kinds of maps. And here's a polar projection, and of course, maybe it's no surprise that the symbol of the United Nations is this polar projection map. So I think today he would be very upset that, we are sort of ripping that world apart. And the United States perhaps is pulling back from that really important role that we played in trying to promote these fundamental four freedoms, which, of course, we've got right here in this room: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear.
I think, no, unfortunately, we're out of time. But I can announce the good news that there is a reception following this, so you will all be able to, A, buy David's wonderful book, but B, you will be able to talk to David and ask questions informally. Can I also just add my thanks to all of you for coming tonight, to Harold and Jim for organising this wonderful event, and congratulations again to David. Thank you.
Richard.